The audience held its breath. In the middle of the stage, under the golden lights, an old man with a white beard and worn clothing stretched out his hand toward André Rieu. Nobody understood what was happening. He had no permission to be there, least of all in the middle of the concert. And even more surprising, the man was blind. In his hand he held only a small, crumpled piece of paper. Rieu took the note, read it in silence, and seconds later tears streamed down his face. What was written there was impossible to imagine. Samuel Thompson had wandered the streets of Chicago for years, almost always ignored by the people hurrying past. His eyes had failed him 10 years ago as a result of diabetes that had gone untreated too long when he still had a home and insurance card. Now he was merely a shadow in the crowd, a figure that people preferred not to see. It was a cold November morning in 2025, and Samuel sat in his usual spot by the entrance of the Walmart on Michigan Avenue. His old army jacket, which he had bought at a thrift store before his situation became so dire, was his only protection against the biting wind that swept through the streets of the old city. "Good morning, Samuel," said a familiar voice. He looked up, though he could see nothing, but he recognized the voice immediately. It was Lisa Martinez, one of the few people who knew his name, who treated him as a human being instead of a problem to be solved. "Lisa," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold and lack of use. "You're early today." "I had some extra sandwiches left over from the deli," she said, and he heard the rustle of a paper bag. "And I thought maybe Samuel would like a couple." Samuel felt the warmth of the bag as she placed it in his hands. It wasn't just the physical warmth of fresh bread that touched him, but the warmth of human kindness, something that had become so rare in his life that every small act of care felt like a miracle. "Thank you," he mumbled. "You don't have to." "Of course I do," she interrupted him gently. "We're neighbors, aren't we? Neighbors look out for each other." Neighbors. The word touched him deeply. He had felt no sense of community for so long, no sense of belonging anywhere. For most people he was invisible, a problem they tried to avoid rather than solve. "Lisa," he said hesitantly, "may I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone." She sat beside him on the cold sidewalk, her compassion warmer than any coat. "Of course, Samuel, tell me everything." Before all this happened," he began, gesturing to his current situation, "I played violin. Not professionally, but I was good at it. My teacher always said I had talent." "What happened to your violin?" Samuel's face darkened. "Sold. When I lost my apartment, it was one of the first things I had to sell to pay rent. I thought it was temporary, that I could buy it back when things got better, and then things didn't get better. No, they got worse and worse, and now—" He stopped, overwhelmed by the memory of everything he had lost. Not just his home, his job, his independence, but also his art, his way of expressing himself. "I miss the music most," he whispered. "Not just playing, but feeling the violin under my chin, feeling how the music flows through my body. It was the only thing that really made me feel alive." Lisa felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had known Samuel for months as a quiet, dignified man who never asked for anything except the right to exist. She had never known that there was an artist hidden behind that worn exterior. "Do you still listen to music?" "Whenever I can. Sometimes radios are on in stores. Sometimes someone plays on the street. And every time André Rieu is in town, his face lit up as if he had turned on an internal light. I can hear the music from the theater. You know, the walls aren't that thick, and music always finds a way." "You're a fan of André Rieu?" "More than a fan. He plays music as music is meant to be played, with his heart, not just with his hands. Every time I hear him play, I remember why I love music. It gives me—" He searched for the right words. "It gives me hope that beauty still exists in the world." Lisa listened, her heart breaking for this man who had lost so much, but still had the capacity to appreciate beauty, to find hope in music that filtered through walls. "Samuel, when is André Rieu's next concert?" "Tonight," he said immediately. "I always know when he's coming. I count down the days." "And you listen from outside?" "I go as close to the theater as possible without disturbing security. Usually there's a spot behind the building where you can hear the music. It's not the same as being there, but it's enough." Lisa thought about what he had told her, about this man who had lost so much, but still sought beauty wherever he could find it. She thought about the theatre where she had gone as a child with her grandmother, about the magic of live music, about how it felt to be part of an audience experiencing something beautiful together. "Samuel," she said suddenly, "what if I could get you a ticket?" He shook his head. "Lisa, you're already so kind to me, and besides, I can't. I mean, look at me. I don't belong in a theatre full of well-dressed people. Every person deserves to hear music if they want to, especially someone who understands it like you do." "It would be a dream," he admitted, "but dreams are for people with futures. I only have today." "Maybe," said Lisa, a plan forming in her head. "Today is enough." She stayed with him for another hour, talking about music, about life, about the small moments of beauty that exist even in the darkest times. When she left, she pressed some money into his hand. Not much, but enough for a warm meal. "See you later, Samuel, and think about what I said about tonight." That afternoon, Samuel wandered through the city, listening to the sounds of preparation for the concert, trucks unloading instruments, people talking about where they would eat before the show. The excitement that hangs in the air when a beloved artist comes to visit. He found his usual spot behind the theatre, where he knew there was a bench that gave him a reasonably good position near the back of the building. Not that he could see, but he knew every stone of this part of Chicago after years of wandering. When the first notes of the sound check filtered through the walls, Samuel felt his heart leap. It was "The Blue Danube," one of his favorites. A piece he had once learned to play but never perfected. He closed his eyes, a habit he had developed since his blindness, though it made no difference, and let the music flow through him. For a moment he was no longer a homeless man listening through walls. He was a musician again, his hands moving in the air as if he were playing along, his body swaying with the rhythm. "Sir, you can't stay here." The voice of a security guard broke his reverie. Samuel opened his eyes and turned toward the voice. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'll leave." "Wait," said the guard, and Samuel heard something friendlier in his voice. "You're the man who always comes to listen, aren't you? I've seen you before. I don't cause trouble." "I know, you just sit and listen. I'm Marcus Williams, head of security." Samuel Thompson. Marcus had indeed noticed Samuel before, a quiet figure who appeared at every concert, never caused problems. Just listened with a concentration that made Marcus feel respect for the man's dedication to music. "Listen, Samuel. Normally I'd have to ask you to leave, but I've seen you listening. You're a true lover, aren't you? Music is all I have left." Marcus felt something stir in his chest. He also loved music. That's why he had taken this job, to be closer to the artists he admired. But he had never thought about people like Samuel who loved music, but never had access to it. "Stay here," he said. "I'll be right back." 20 minutes later, Marcus returned, and he wasn't alone. With him walked an elegant woman in a dark coat. "Samuel, this is Ms. Richardson, the theatre manager. I told her about you." Samuel stood up, suddenly aware of his appearance in the company of this clearly successful woman. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice warm but professional. "Marcus told me you're a faithful listener. I try not to cause problems." "You don't cause problems. On the contrary. It's heartwarming to hear that our music is so appreciated. Marcus said you're a musician yourself?" "Was, long ago. Once a musician, always a musician," she said, smiling. "Listen, I have an unused seat in the back row. Would you like to be our guest tonight?" Samuel couldn't believe it. "You're offering me a ticket. I'm offering you a place to listen to music as it's meant to be heard, with respect, with appreciation, with people who understand it like you do." Tears began to appear in Samuel's blind eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come," said Marcus. "And don't worry about clothing or anything. Music is about what's in your heart, not what you wear." That evening, for the first time in 10 years, Samuel Thompson sat in a concert hall. Surrounded by people who shared the same love of music as he did, he could feel the energy, the anticipation, the collective joy of people gathering to experience something beautiful. When André Rieu took the stage, Samuel felt his heart leap. The music began, and for the first time in years, he was no longer an outsider listening through walls. He was part of the experience, part of the community of music lovers. But as he sat listening, something began to grow within him, a desire he had tried to suppress since he had lost everything. It wasn't enough just to listen. He wanted to make contact, wanted somehow to let them know how much this music meant to him. In his jacket pocket, He felt the small piece of paper he always carried with him, a letter he had written years ago but never sent, a letter to André Rieu, written in a moment of despair, but also of hope. Maybe, he thought, this was the moment to make that hope reality. The concert had been going for an hour, and Samuel sat in his seat in the back row, completely absorbed in the music flowing through the hall. Every note reached him with a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. This was different from listening through walls. This was pure, undiluted music as it was meant to be heard. André Rieu stood on stage, his usual charismatic self, leading the orchestra through a selection of classical favorites and popular melodies. The audience sang along, laughed, applauded. It was the perfect André Rieu experience that thousands of people around the world knew and loved, but for Samuel, it was more than entertainment. It was a reunion with a part of himself he thought he had lost. Every melody brought back memories of his own attempts to play these pieces, of the joy he felt when he finally mastered a difficult passage, of the dreams he had once harbored. "Ladies and gentlemen," André said into the microphone, "this next piece is something special. It's a piece I learned from my own teacher when I was still a boy, and it's about hope. Hope that persists even when everything seems dark." He began Pachelbel's canon in D, and Samuel felt his breath catch. This was the first piece he had ever learned on the violin, the first moment he understood what music could truly be. Not just sound, but emotion given form. As the music swelled through the hall, Samuel felt something break inside him. It was as if all the years of loss, of loneliness, of silent endurance suddenly found an outlet. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the crumpled piece of paper he always carried with him. The letter he had written 3 years ago in a moment of despair and hope, addressed to the man who now stood on stage. He had never sent it because he didn't know how, because he was afraid of rejection, because it seemed like an unreachable fantasy. But now, sitting in the same space as his hero, listening to music that touched his soul, Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in years. Courage. Not the courage to survive. He had to summon that every day. But the courage to live, to make contact, to make a connection that went beyond mere survival. Slowly, carefully, so as not to disturb the people around him, Samuel stood up from his seat. He had left his white cane at home. He had thought he would just sit and listen. Now he had to navigate through the hall on hearing and instinct alone. "Excuse me," he whispered to the woman next to him. "May I get by?" She looked up, shocked, not because of his question, but because he was clearly blind and trying to maneuver through the row. "Sir, are you all right?" "Perfect," he said, and for the first time in years he meant it. He began slowly moving through the row, his hands lightly resting on the backs of seats to find his way. People looked at him, initially irritated by the disruption, but then concerned when they realized there was something more happening than an ordinary trip to the restroom. "He's blind," someone whispered. "Where is he going?" Samuel reached the aisle and began walking forward, his feet carefully testing each step. The music continued, André Rieu and the orchestra unaware of the drama unfolding in the audience. Patricia Davis, sitting in the middle of the hall, was one of the first to understand what was happening. She was a retired teacher, accustomed to observing human behavior, and she immediately saw that this man wasn't lost. He was moving with determination, with purpose. "He's going to the stage," she whispered to her husband. "That blind man is going to the stage. That's impossible. Security will stop him." But Marcus Williams, who was manning his usual post at the side entrance, was momentarily distracted by a small incident in the back of the hall. A woman who had become ill and needed medical attention. His team was busy with that situation, and no one had noticed Samuel's slow, determined march forward. Samuel reached the front row and felt the edge of the stage. He had known this theatre before he went blind. He had been here once for a concert years before his life began to unravel. He knew there was a small staircase on the left side used by orchestra members to get on and off the stage. The music reached a crescendo, and under cover of the sound, Samuel began climbing the steps. Now the audience really began to notice what was happening. People started pointing, whispering. Some even stood up to get a better view. "There's someone on the stage," someone said loudly enough to be heard. "Is that part of the show?" "He's not wearing a costume. He looks like a homeless man." André Rieu was so focused on his conducting that he initially didn't notice the commotion in the audience, but then he felt a change in the atmosphere of the hall, a tension that hadn't been there before. He turned around and saw Samuel standing at the edge of the stage, an old man in worn clothing, clearly not belonging to the orchestra or crew. The music stopped abruptly as André raised his hands. The orchestra fell silent, and suddenly the entire hall was in absolute silence. Thousands of eyes were focused on Samuel, who stood there in the bright stage lights, his blind eyes staring at something no one else could see. "Sir," André said carefully, his voice carrying through the microphone to every corner of the hall. "Can you hear me?" Samuel turned toward the voice, his face lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Rieu," he said, his voice weak but clearly audible in the silence. "I've waited so long to meet you." Marcus Williams had finally appeared at the side of the stage, ready to intervene, but André gestured for him to stay back. "What's your name?" André asked kindly. "Samuel Thompson. And you?" "You are my hero." The audience held its breath. This was no planned stunt, no part of the show. This was real. A genuine meeting between an artist and someone whose life was clearly marked by hardship. "Samuel," André said, "how did you get here?" "I always listened to your music from outside through the walls, but tonight I got a ticket and I had to give you something." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. "I wrote this 3 years ago," he said, his voice now growing stronger. "I wanted to send it, but I didn't know how. I thought you'd never read it, but now." He held the paper out toward André, his hand trembling with emotion. André looked at the audience, at the thousands of faces looking up at him, then at the old man who had shown such courage to come here. He walked toward Samuel and took the note. "Thank you, Samuel," he said softly. The audience watched in breathless silence as André unfolded the paper. It was clear it had been folded and unfolded many times, carried in a pocket through weather and wind. A precious possession of someone who had few precious possessions. André began to read, his eyes moving over the handwritten words. His face changed as he read. First curiosity, then surprise, then something deeper. His eyes began to glisten, and his hand went to his heart. "My God," he whispered, and though he wasn't speaking into the microphone, the hall was so quiet that many could hear him. He looked up at Samuel, then at the audience, then back at the note in his hands. Tears began to appear in his eyes. The silence that descended over the theatre was so complete, it seemed as if even the air itself was holding its breath. 2,000 people sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the incredible tableau unfolding before them. A blind homeless man stood beside the world-famous André Rieu, who held a crumpled piece of paper in his hands as if it were made of gold. Patricia, sitting in the 9th row, felt her heart pounding in her chest. In her 70 years she had attended many concerts, but never anything like this. This wasn't entertainment, this was something much deeper, something that erased the boundary between performer and audience. "What do you think is in that letter?" whispered her husband Robert beside her. "Something that's breaking his heart," she replied, looking at the tears now streaming freely down André's face. Further back in the hall, people began to move uncomfortably. This wasn't what they had expected when they bought their tickets. They had come for cheerfulness, for waltzes and sing-along moments, not for this raw, unprotected human drama. "Is this part of the show?" a young woman asked her mother. "No, honey," the older woman replied. "This is real life." On stage, Samuel stood patiently waiting, his blind eyes focused on André, though he couldn't see him. His whole body radiated a mixture of nervousness and relief, the nervousness of someone who had taken an enormous risk, and the relief of someone who had finally done what he had wanted to do for years. André looked at the note again, his lips moving as he reread the words. The audience could see that whatever was on that paper was affecting him deeply, not just as a celebrity receiving a compliment, but as a human being confronted with something that changed his world-view. André carefully folded the note and looked at Samuel, then at the audience that was watching them expectantly. "Samuel," he said finally, his voice carrying through the microphone to every corner of the hall. "This letter, when did you write this?" 3 years ago, Samuel replied, his own voice now also carrying through the stage microphones. "On my darkest day, the day I thought I had lost everything. And what has happened since then?" Samuel smiled. Not the forced smile of someone trying to be brave, but the serene smile of someone who had found peace with his path. I learned that you can lose everything except your love for beauty. Every night when you were in town, I went to stand outside the theater to listen. Your music, it kept me going. It reminded me that there are still beautiful things in the world. The audience now listened intently, their earlier discomfort replaced by fascination. This wasn't an interruption of their evening out. This was something much rarer, a glimpse into the pure power of human connection through art. André felt the weight of the moment on his shoulders. Thousands of people were looking at him, waiting for his response, his leadership in this unexpected situation. But he also felt drawn to this man, whose courage and love for music were so tangible. "Samuel," he said, his voice full of emotion, "would you like to tell the audience what's in your letter?" Samuel hesitated, suddenly aware of the thousands of eyes focused on him, even though he couldn't see them. "They're just words from a lonely man," he said modestly. "Sometimes those are the most important words of all," André replied. In the hall, people began looking at each other, realizing they were witnessing something that could change their perspective on compassion, on art, on what it means to be human. "The audience deserves the truth," André said to Samuel, "and you deserve to be heard." Samuel nodded slowly, gathering his courage, and began to speak, his voice trembling but steadily determined. "The letter says—" He stopped, took a deep breath. "The letter says that when I could still see, I played violin, and that your music keeps me alive now that everything is different." The silence that followed was so intense, you could hear people breathing in the hall. These weren't just words. This was a confession, a testimony to the power of music to heal, to give hope where no hope seemed to exist. André looked again at the note in his hands, then at the audience, and realized this moment was bigger than himself, bigger than the concert, bigger than anything he had planned. André carefully unfolded the letter, treating it with the reverence one would show a religious document. The paper was thin and yellowed, clearly folded and unfolded many times, carried in a pocket through all the weather conditions a homeless man endures. "May I read it?" André asked softly. Samuel nodded, his blind eyes glistening with tears he wasn't trying to hide. André addressed the audience, holding the letter in his hands as if it were the most precious object he had ever touched. His voice, which had sounded through microphones thousands of times, now trembled with emotion. "Dear Mr. Rieu," he read, and his voice broke at the first words. He stopped, took a deep breath, and tried again. "Dear Mr. Rieu, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I have to write it before I lose courage." The audience leaned forward, catching every word like precious drops of water in a desert. "My name is Samuel Thompson. I am 62 years old, and 3 years ago I lost my eyesight to diabetes. Before that, I lost my house, my job, and almost everything I owned. But the worst loss was my violin." André's voice grew stronger as he read, driven by the power of Samuel's words. "I had that violin since I was 20. It wasn't a Stradivarius like yours, but it was my voice, my way of talking to the world. When I had to sell it to survive, it felt like I was selling a part of my soul." In the audience, people began crying openly. Patricia Davis held her husband's hand, both overwhelmed by the pain and beauty of this unexpected confession. "But then," André continued, his voice now full of the hope he heard in Samuel's words, "I heard your music, not in a concert hall, not on the radio, but through the walls of the theater when you played here. And for the first time since I lost my violin, I felt connected to music again." André paused, looked at Samuel, who stood beside him with an expression of peace that everyone in the hall could feel. "Your music reminded me why I loved music, not because it would make me famous or earn money, but because it made me feel part of something bigger than myself. Every time you played, I stood outside and listened, and I felt human again." Tears now flowed freely down André's face. In all his years of performing, he had received thousands of compliments, but none had touched him like these simple, honest words from a man who had lost everything except his love for music. "I'm writing this because I want you to know," André read further, his voice now so soft the audience had to lean forward to hear every word, "that your music saves lives. Not in a dramatic way, but in the daily way of giving hope to people who have almost given up." André looked up at Samuel. "Is there more?" "Yes," whispered Samuel. the most important part. André looked back at the letter, his hands now trembling with emotion. I'll probably never get the chance to tell you this personally, but I wanted you to know. When I could still see, I played violin. Your music keeps me alive, and if I ever got the chance to meet you, I would want to ask you to play together, so I could feel again what it's like to make music instead of just listening. The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed as if time itself had stopped. André looked at the letter, at Samuel, at the audience watching them in breathless anticipation. "It's signed," he said with a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "With all love and respect, your most faithful listener, Samuel Thompson." André carefully folded the letter and looked at Samuel. 3 years ago you wrote this. "On my darkest day," Samuel confirmed. "The day I thought music had disappeared from my life forever. And now you're here. Now I'm here." André looked out over the audience, saw the thousands of faces looking up at them, saw the tears, the emotion, the silent expectation of what would happen now. "Samuel," he said, his voice now growing stronger, driven by a determination that came from the deepest part of his heart. "You asked in your letter if we could play together." "That was a dream," Samuel said modestly. "An impossible dream." "No dream is impossible if you're willing to fight for it," André replied. "And you have fought. You're here. You showed courage that most people will never have." He turned to his orchestra, gestured to the first violinist. "Can you lend Samuel your violin?" The first violinist immediately stood up, his own eyes full of tears, and walked to the center of the stage with his instrument. "But I haven't played in years," Samuel protested. "My hands, they don't remember the positions anymore, and I can't see the notes." "Music isn't in your hands or your eyes," André said softly. "It's in your heart, and your heart has never stopped playing." The first violinist handed Samuel his violin. Samuel took it with trembling hands, felt the familiar weight, the smooth wood, the tension of the strings. "I don't know if I still remember." "Try it," André said, "just for yourself, just to feel." Samuel slowly raised the violin, placed it under his chin. His left hand instinctively found the right position on the neck. His right hand gripped the bow. For a moment he stood there, a blind man on a lit stage, surrounded by thousands of people, a violin in his hands and memories in his heart. Then he drew the bow across the strings. The first note was weak, uncertain. The second was clearer. The third was pure. And then Samuel Thompson, the blind homeless man who had lost everything except his love for music, began to play. It wasn't perfect. His fingers were stiff from years of disuse. His timing was uncertain. But it was music, real human music that came from a place deeper than technique, deeper than training. He played amazing grace, slowly, hesitantly at first, but then with growing confidence. It was a song about redemption, about finding hope in the darkest places. The audience listened in absolute silence, witnessing something that went beyond entertainment, beyond performance. They were witnessing the rebirth of an artist, of a human being finding his voice again. When Samuel played the last note, the silence lingered like a blessing over the hall. André wiped away his tears and began slowly clapping. The audience followed, but it wasn't the usual enthusiastic applause of a concert. It was something much deeper. Recognition, respect, love for a fellow human being who had shown incredible courage. "Thank you," whispered Samuel, his own tears now flowing freely. "Thank you for letting me play." "No," André said, putting his arm around Samuel's shoulders. "Thank you for reminding me why music truly exists." The applause continued, but it was different from anything the theater had ever experienced. It wasn't loud or noisy. It was deep, respectful, full of an emotion that went beyond ordinary appreciation. This was applause for courage, for humanity, for the power of the human spirit to create beauty despite all adversity. Samuel stood there, the violin still in his hands, overwhelmed by what had just happened. For the first time in years, he had made music, real music, not just in his head or his memories, but actually tangible, audible to others. "How do you feel?" André asked softly. "Complete," Samuel replied, his voice full of wonder. "For the first time in years, I feel complete." André looked out over the audience, saw the thousands of faces looking up at them with a mixture of emotion, respect, and something deeper, a recognition of their own shared humanity. "Friends," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "what we have experienced tonight goes beyond music. We have witnessed the power of dreams that refuse to die, of courage that is greater than circumstances." He looked at Samuel, who stood beside him with the violin still pressed against his chest. "This man has taught me something tonight. He has reminded me that music isn't about fame or achievement or even perfect performance. It's about connection, connection with our deepest selves, with each other, with something greater than ourselves." The audience listened in intense silence, taking in every word. Samuel wrote in his letter that my music kept him alive, but tonight he has given me something far more valuable. He has reminded me why I became a musician, not for applause, not for recognition, but for moments like these when music shows its true power. André turned to his orchestra. "Friends, will you play with us? For Samuel, for everyone here tonight who has learned that dreams have no expiration date." The orchestra members stood as one, picking up their instruments with a reverence rarely seen in their professional careers. "What shall we play?" asked the first violinist. André looked at Samuel. "What would you like to play with a full orchestra?" Samuel thought for a moment, his face lighting up with an idea. "Pachelbel's Canon in D. It was the first piece I ever learned, and it's about hope. Hope that persists through all seasons of life." "Perfect," André said. "Maestros," he turned to his orchestra. "Canon in D, but slowly, with space for our friend to lead when he feels called to." The orchestra began the familiar opening of one of the most beautiful compositions ever written. The notes filled the hall, rich and full, a perfect backdrop for what was to come. Samuel listened for a moment, his body moving with the rhythm, his mind returning to the first time he had heard this piece, to the first time he had tried to play it. Then he raised his violin and joined the orchestra. This time his playing was more confident, fuller. It was as if playing Amazing Grace had removed a barrier, had reminded him of what his hands and heart had always known. But what happened was more than just music. The audience could feel how Samuel was being transformed by playing. From a broken man watching life pass him by to an artist taking his place in something beautiful and meaningful. Patricia Davis cried openly as she watched. "Look at him," she whispered to her husband. "Look how he's changing. It's like he's coming back to life." It was true. With every note Samuel played, he seemed to become more himself. Not the homeless man living in the shadows, but the musician he had always been deep inside. When the piece reached its climax, Samuel did something remarkable. He began to improvise, adding his own melodic lines to Pachelbel's timeless composition. It was as if years of suppressed creativity were finally finding an outlet. André listened in amazement as Samuel's improvisation wove through the orchestra, creating something new and beautiful from something old and familiar. This wasn't an amateur trying to keep up. This was a master musician finding his voice again. "My God," André murmured to himself. "He's extraordinary." The orchestra felt it too. One by one, other sections began adding their own subtle variations, inspired by Samuel's courage to go beyond the written notes. It became a collective improvisation, a moment of pure musical magic where professional musicians and a homeless man came together in perfect harmony. When the music finally faded away, the silence that followed was so deep and meaningful that no one dared move, afraid of breaking the spell. André placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder. "That was incredible. Where did you learn to improvise like that?" Samuel smiled, his face radiant with joy. "I didn't learn it. It just came. It was like all the music I've heard while standing outside listening finally found a way out." "You're not an amateur," André said with genuine admiration. "You're a real musician." "I am what music has made of me." André turned to the audience. "Friends, what we experienced tonight I will never forget, and I hope you will never forget it either. Because what Samuel has shown us is that talent doesn't die, not even under the most difficult circumstances. Love for beauty survives everything." He looked again at Samuel. "And now I want to tell you something. From tonight on, Samuel is no longer a homeless man. He is my guest, my friend, and if he wants, my colleague musician." The audience burst into the loudest applause of the evening, but André raised his hand for silence. "There's more. I have decided to establish a fund, the Samuel Thompson Fund, dedicated to finding and supporting hidden talent among people society has forgotten. Because if there's one Samuel, there are more. And every person deserves the chance to share their gift. Samuel stood there, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn his life had taken, from invisible wanderer to honored guest in a matter of hours. "Why?" he asked André. "Why are you doing all this for me?" André looked at him with tears in his eyes. "Because you have given me something money can't buy. You reminded me who I really am, why I do what I do. You showed me that real music doesn't come from perfect technique, but from a perfect heart." He turned to the audience for his final words of the evening. "Friends, we end tonight not with a waltz or a cheerful song. We end with a memory, the memory that beauty exists all around us, even in places where we don't expect it. That courage has many faces, but the most beautiful face is the face of someone who makes their dreams come true despite all adversity." He looked at Samuel, who was returning the borrowed violin to the first violinist. "And sometimes," André continued, "it's not eyesight that guides us, but the faith that survives in the heart." Samuel couldn't see us, but he saw what was most important, the chance to share beauty, to make connection, to show that we all, regardless of our circumstances, have something valuable to offer. He bowed deeply to Samuel, then to the audience. "Thank you for being witnesses to a miracle. And remember, dreams have no expiration date. It's never too late to let your voice be heard." As the applause rolled through the hall, André embraced Samuel. Two men, one world famous, one forgotten by the world, united by their love for music and their faith in the power of the human spirit. "What happens now?" Samuel asked. "Now," André said, smiling, "we go home, your new home, and tomorrow we begin the rest of your life." As they left the stage together, hand in hand, everyone in the hall knew they had witnessed something that would change their own lives. They had learned that true wealth isn't measured in money or possessions, but in the courage to love, to dream, to create beauty despite all adversity. And in the years that followed, when people looked back on this evening, they wouldn't remember which songs were played or how perfect the performance was. They would remember how it felt to see love and courage transform a life, how music could build a bridge between two worlds, and how sometimes the most unexpected encounters are the most meaningful. Because this had been more than a concert. This had been a lesson in humanity, a reminder that we are all connected by our shared love for beauty, our need for connection, and our belief that tomorrow can be better than today.